Welcome to the Electric City Archives. This is the first in a series of podcasts celebrating the long and fascinating history of Schenectady and the surrounding area. My name is Bill Buell. I'm the Schenectady County Historian, and today we're talking with Jessica Polmateer, the Alplaus historian. We're going to talk about Kurt Vonnegut, the noted author who lived in Alplaus for, well, we'll find out exactly how long he lived in Alplaus when we ask Jessica. Jessica, when did you first get interested in Kurt Vonnegut?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I've been the Alplaus historian for a couple of years now, and when I first became the historian, I went to the archives just to kind of check out what was there. And
when you say the archives, you mean?
We have just a large filing cabinet full of archives. Okay. And I wanted to see what was there in the files, and I kept seeing Kurt Vonnegut's name come up in the files, and I said, I wonder what's going on here. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of did some research, and I found out that he had lived in Alplaus and worked for GE, and then I just did more research, and my interest kind of went on from there.
And had you been a fan of his?
Well, I had, I grown up in upstate New York, so definitely having gone to school in upstate New York, I had read a lot of his work just from being in high school in upstate New York and being assigned a lot of his work. But as an adult now, I've read a lot of his stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You mentioned upstate New York, which is where we are. Where are you from?
Actually, I grew up in Alplaus, and we moved away. We moved a town away to Rexford, and I went to school in Niskayuna. And then as an adult, when I was pregnant with my son, we ended up moving back to Alplaus. So now we're in Alplaus again.
Okay. How long did Kurt Vonnegut spend working at GE and living in Alplaus? When did that all happen? So
he came back in 1947 and only spent a few years in Alplaus. He left in 1951. Okay. So it wasn't actually very much time, but they were very important years for us as a town.
And what was he doing for GE?
He was working for the news bureau in GE. He was writing stories that really put GE in a good light, I would say. At the time in the 50s, GE wanted to show the world what a great job they were doing and what their inventions, what we're doing for, for the common man. So Kurt Vonnegut, that was his job. So
did he write player piano when he was living in Alplaus? And tell us a little bit about player piano.
So it's interesting. I, have, in the beginning when I was doing my research for the piece that I wrote for the Historical Society, I found a lot of different things that said, yes, he wrote player piano while living in Alplaus and while working in Cheney's store, which is right on the main drag in Alplaus, on Alplaus Avenue. However, for this presentation that I was going to do in March, which has since been canceled and rescheduled for next year, 2021, I have read some things that state he may have finished player piano while he was living in Cape Cod. Jury's still out. There's not a really good way to kind of tell where he finished it, but I still think that he did do a majority of his work on player piano in Alplaus. It was published when he was living on Cape Cod in 1952.
And what was the book about?
Player piano was very controversial at the time. It was actually it was about Ilium, which was a city. A lot of people say it was about Troy because Ilium is a Greek word for Troy. However, he actually did write it about Schenectady. It was a satire about Schenectady. A lot of it was based on things he saw when he was working for GE. When it was published, because Schenectady was a GE town, there wasn't a single bookstore really? That in Schenectady that stocked it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
that's interesting. Let's go back a little bit. I read a couple of weeks ago that his mother committed suicide. He also spent time in the U.S. Army and was captured in Germany and spent time in prisoner of war camp in Dresden. So how did all these experiences affect him, do you think?
Well, let me go back to the suicide. So there are differing accounts of the suicide. Some in the family, in the Vonnegut family, think that it was not a suicide. Mm-hmm. His mother had some issues with alcohol, and so there were barbiturates involved. And when you mix alcohol and barbiturates, there's a problem. And so some say that it was an accident due to her, use of both alcohol and barbiturates together. So we're not sure to this day. A lot of people do say that it was intentional suicide. She was very unhappy. His mother was very unhappy. Mm-hmm. She had come from a very wealthy background. Her family was very wealthy. When Kurt was a young boy, their family had gone through the Depression, so there was, some issues there with losing a lot of their money. And his father, had gone from, a very prosperous life to kind of, he went kind of to more of an artist's existence, mm-hmm. which I don't think his mother was very happy with. So she became kind of a bitter woman. So yeah, there was some unhappiness there, which some people say, she did commit suicide. Mm-hmm. Kurt was not clear on it, whether it was or not. It did happen on Mother's Day, which was very sad. Mm-hmm. So regardless if it was accidental or not. So that's that part of it. As far as the Dresden situation, that was awful as well. So he was at his nature a pacifist. He was called later in his life very much a anti-war. A lot of his books were kind of anti-war novels. He never really wanted to go into the war to begin with, but when he was at Cornell, he was going to fail out, and so he knew he was going to be drafted anyway mm-hmm. into World War II. So he decided to enlist. And so when he enlisted, he was captured at the Battle of the Bulge, and went through the firebombing at Dresden, and ended up going through this terrible, and it was the Allies that bombed, and so I think there was some issues there with him feeling like, it was his own people that had bombed them, even though obviously, he was a prisoner of war at the time. So he took refuge in an underground meat locker. And that's how he survived this bombing that killed 135,000 people, mm-hmm. Which was the same number at the time, or a similar number, as were killed by the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So it was this enormous, bombing. And so then he was conscripted by the enemy to help with the recovery of the bodies. So he was part of this terrible recovery process. Mm-hmm. Saw a lot of carnage. Then couldn't talk about it for many, many years afterwards. Mm-hmm. So, it affected him greatly, and it took him, 20 years to write Slaughterhouse-Five based on these events and how affected he was.
Well, that leads to my next question. Have you developed some kind of sense of what he was like as a person? I'm assuming he was maybe quiet and withdrawn as opposed to being the life of the party.
Well, when he and Jane, his wife, his first wife, I should say, were living in Alplaus, they did have a lot of parties, actually, mm-hmm. and were very well liked by their neighbors. When he sold one of his first stories to Collier's magazine for $750, they actually threw a huge party for all their neighbors. I think he was relatively well liked by a lot of his neighbors. he was considered subversive, but I feel like that was kind of later in life when a lot of his novels were coming out, when he showed his views more. When he was a younger man when he lived in Schenectady, when he was a younger man in Schenectady County, I think people liked him a lot. And he was maybe not necessarily social. He did a lot of quiet writing in the home and then later at Cheney's store, but he was on the fire department, and he was definitely involved in the community. I think in later life he was definitely known as a subversive. I don't know anyone now who doesn't have a strong opinion on him, if they know him. I mean, some people aren't Vonnegut fans and don't really know his work, but if you know his work, I feel like he's polarizing. You either love Vonnegut and you think he's, this person who's done a lot for society, or you really just don't like him and think that he's, this huge subversive and he's done a lot.
Are there people in Alplaus, residents, who remember him?
Yes. There's a few left that still know him. There is one gentleman who has moved up the road to Rexford, who the people who bought the house from the Vonneguts when they moved to Cape Cod, and he has a lot of wonderful recollections of the Vonneguts because they were very close friends of them, and so there are a couple left who do know him.
And the house he lived in is still there?
It is still there.
It's a private home?
Yes, it is a private home.
And is Cheney's still there?
Yes, so it is now it's called Samuel's now, and it was for a while a bunch of different things. It was the general store when I was a young child, the Alplaus General Store. It was Cheney's Market before that, and a gas station. It was Samuel's Restaurant for a little while. It was like a little cafe, and now it's rented by a tech company, so it's not open to the public.
He needed a part-time job to make ends meet?
At the time when he was writing in Alplaus.
So he's working at GE full-time, right?
He was, yes, to support the family. And then, and he had 2 children at the time, so he needed a full-time job. So he was working at GE, and but he, didn't want to do that. He wanted to write. So he was writing part-time, always writing on weekends and in evenings. He was diligent, always writing, but knew that he wanted to leave GE. His goal was to sell 5 stories. That was his goal. He knew that if he could sell 5 stories, that he could, continue making that kind of money, that he could support the family on that income. I think novels for him came later. It was always the short stories that were, the beginning of it for him.
And have you read a few of his books?
I have read a few of his books. I have not read all of them. My favorite is God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which is the one that he wrote based on Alplaus and his time in Alplaus.
Oh, okay. Jessica Polmateer, thank you very much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.